Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. On April 22nd of this year, a brutal terrorist attack in the idyllic tourist hub of Pahalgam in the Indian Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir brought India and Pakistan to the brink of all-out war. This attack saw the massacre of 26 tourists, possibly the deadliest attack on Indian civilians since the Mumbai attacks in 2008. And the group that initially claimed responsibility was a little known outfit that called itself the Resistance Front, or TRF for short. The Indian government claims that this is an offshoot of the internationally recognized terrorist organization, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, or LET for short, which actually did perpetrate the Mumbai attacks and is believed to have strong ties to the Pakistan Intelligence Services, the ISI. Pakistan, for its part, denies that it was responsible in any way and points to the LET being nominally banned in Pakistan for several years. Although the brief conflict ended in a ceasefire after 4 days of escalation, it certainly isn't the first nor the last time an attack like this has led to open hostilities between the two states and has brought back into global headlines the region that is the source of South Asia's longest running and bloodiest conflict, the land dispute that has plagued the nations of India and Pakistan since their very inception. I am speaking, of course, about Kashmir. What is Kashmir exactly? Is it the manifestation of paradise on earth, as the Mughal Emperor Jahangir and so many others after him have claimed it to be? Or is it just one of those intractable, unending post colonial conflicts that, much like Israel Palestine, has just become a byword for a long standing, unsolvable obstacle to global peace? Is it an illegally occupied, inviolable territory of the Union of India? An unjustly seized part of what should rightfully be in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan? Or just a long suffering divided land that had the misfortune of being situated between three hostile nuclear powers? And I'm not even going to get into the China aspect of this because that's just another whole new dimension. But Kashmir is all of that and so much more. And anyone who wants to understand South Asia as it is today has to understand Kashmir. And that is the focus of our episode today. We'll be diving into a history of the Kashmir conflict, its origins and evolution, its importance and impact on the relations between India and Pakistan, and how the Kashmir insurgency evolved into the conflict that resulted in so many horrifying massacres and several wars between the two South Asian nuclear powers. We'll be speaking later to Siddharth Roy about militancy in Kashmir and the precise details surrounding the Pahalgam attack. But first, we'll be speaking to Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed to understand the roots of the Kashmir conflict in the aftermath of the bloody dissolution of the British Indian Empire in the 1940s, and how that conflict has evolved to become South Asia's forever war. Stay tuned. So, joining us today, we have the singular honor of Professor Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, a Swedish political scientist, academic, and author. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Stockholm University, Sweden. Born in Lahore, Pakistan in 1947, Professor Ishtiaq is known for his research on the political history of South Asia, particularly the partition of British India in 1947, and his scholarly work examines the ideological foundations and consequences of the partition, and in particular the role of Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the two-nation theory. Professor Ishtiaq has published a number of books on the subject, including The Punjab, Bloodied, Partitioned, and Cleansed, Jinnah, His Successes, Failures, and Role in History, as well as Pakistan, the Garrison State. I would strongly recommend all of you to read these books and also check out his YouTube channel, which I've learned personally a lot from. So, Professor Ishtiaq, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be on your program. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, Professor Ishtiaq, I think to understand the roots of the Kashmir dispute and the unique role that it plays in India-Pakistan relations, even today, I think we have to go back to the peculiar arrangements that followed the dissolution of the British Indian Empire in the 1940s and the formation of the independent states of India and Pakistan. So, could you describe for our listeners the partition plan, the princely states, and how they were to be allotted to either state? And maybe then talk about the circumstances that led to the First Kashmir War in 1947.
Thank you very much. To begin with, I would say that the British were trying their best to hold on to India through the Cabinet Mission Plan, which actually meant a very decentralized India with the Union government having enjoying only three powers: foreign affairs, defense, and communications, and the right to raise taxes only for these three services. All other powers were vested in the provinces. I've argued that this was unworkable for a state or an area like the Indian subcontinent. The magnitude of problems, the area, the diversity of population required an effective center. Anyhow, when that failed, then they sent Lord Louis Mountbatten as the last viceroy. Originally, the idea was that power will be transferred to Indians by June 1948. When Mountbatten comes to India, he starts talking to all sections of the political spectrum. And after going through discussions with them, he concludes that there was no chance of keeping India united. So, having talked to all of these people, on the 3rd of June, we have the partition plan. By the way, the British had made clear that the transfer of power would mean that paramountcy of the British ends in relation to the princely states. Paramountcy would not be inherited by India or Pakistan. And so the princely states were entitled to work out their relationship with either Pakistan or India, or even remain independent. So the 3rd June plan is just about partitioning British Indian territories, not the princely states. So ultimately, two dominions, independent dominions, were to come into being on the 14th and 15th of August 1947. Just to emphasize a point, you see, Mountbatten almost arbitrarily decided that instead of transferring power in June 1948, he brought the date forward drastically to mid August 1947, which was less than 11 weeks from the 3 June plan. The 3 June plan was accepted by Nehru, then followed Jinnah, and then Sardar Baldev Singh. All of them had their different positions on it, but they accepted it. The thing then to include is the 18th July 1947 Indian Independence Act. Once again, it's about the partitioning of British India, Indian provinces, and didn't apply to the princely states. So, accordingly, these two provinces were partitioned and power was transferred to the independent dominion of India and Pakistan. 14th of August to Pakistan, 15th of August to India, and the actual division of the territories of Punjab and Bengal were made public on the 17th of August 1947 through the Radcliffe Award.
So after the actual independence was announced, then the division of Punjab was announced.
Isn't that very ironic? But I'll tell you the reason. You see, everybody understood that no division of Punjab and Bengal will please all the three communities, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs in Punjab, or Hindus and Muslims in Bengal. There were bound to be objections and possibly rioting taking place. So the award was finally ready on the 13th of August, but Mountbatten advised Cyril Radcliffe, the chairman, to withhold making it public till he had been to Karachi for the celebration of Pakistan independence, and 15th for being in Delhi for India's independence. Then on the 16th evening, all the leaders in Delhi were shown the plan, and on the 17th, it was announced on the radio. And all hell broke loose in Punjab because millions of Hindus and Sikhs were in what became West Punjab of Pakistan, and millions of Muslims were in East Punjab, which became part of India. So that's the background. Regarding the princely states, the Congress party had since a long time taken a position that in future free India, the princely states will be merged into the Indian Union. And the Congress and the Muslim League had taken the position that they would respect the independence of the princely state. Also, the Indian leadership had sort of come to the conclusion that only those princely states which were within Indian territory would be convinced to join the Indian Union. So when, for example, there is some hint that Balochistan wanted to join India, one day the All India Radio announced that Kalat state in Balochistan is going to join India, but next day the Indian government said that that's a wrong news. Similarly, Bahawalpur state, which was on the border with India, but mostly in what became West Pakistan, there were some feelers sent to India that we would like to join India, but the Indians made it clear that we don't want Bahawalpur in India. All other states which finally were merged into India and Pakistan were within their own territories, except now Kashmir. But before I come to Kashmir, it's worth mentioning that it was not clear who had the right to decide for the princely states. Rather, it seemed that it was the rulers, because the paramountcy agreements were with the rulers of these princely states. So on the 15th of August 1947, the Nawab of Junagadh in Gujarat, Indian Gujarat, he decided to accede to Pakistan. Junagadh was quite a distance from the India-Pakistan border which had been established. The distance between Junagadh's city and Karachi is, for example, 313 kilometers. So you can well imagine this decision. And he had flown to Karachi with his family and with his dogs and so on. On the 13th of September, Pakistan accepted the Nawab's accession to Pakistan. So Pakistan established a precedent that the ruler is to decide for his state. Also, Jinnah had been flirting with the ruler of, I think, Jodhpur and even Jaisalmer, trying to convince them to join Pakistan, but I think they were dissuaded by. So now, when we come to Kashmir, the problem begins with, and this is something which in India is hushed up, and in Pakistan they hate me for bringing it in the public. Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan and his advisor Chaudhry Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali later on became the Prime Minister of Pakistan in 1955 for a year. They were in Delhi in December 1947. The partition committees of different sorts were still meeting. And there was a discussion between Sardar Patel, the Home Minister, and Nawabzada Liaquat Ali Khan, Pakistan's Prime Minister. And Sardar Patel said, why do you keep on talking about Junagadh? Let's try to settle Kashmir and Hyderabad. You keep Kashmir and you leave Hyderabad alone. This is mentioned by Chaudhry Muhammad Ali in his book, The Emergence of Pakistan, and I think it's on the page 239, if you want to check. Also, there is another source. K.H. Khurshid was private secretary of Jinnah from 1944 till September 1947. He wrote a book, My Memoirs of Jinnah, and he then went to people who were close to Jinnah and he talked to Chaudhry Muhammad Ali for further clarifications on the Kashmir question. And Chaudhry Muhammad Ali told him that in December 1947, we were sent a message by India that Pakistan keeps Kashmir and Hyderabad remains with India. And I took this message to Jinnah, who did not seem to be interested. Jinnah, the clever tactician, it seems was playing for some higher stakes on the princely states, but obviously he did not succeed. Now, to explain why Jinnah spurned this offer, I think his military advisors around him must have told him that, we will militarily annex Kashmir. The majority population of Kashmir is Muslim, and we have supporters in Kashmir. So why should we compromise on Hyderabad? And the second thing was that while the whole idea was that the princely states could remain independent, there was Sir Conrad, a British parliamentarian, I think, or bureaucrat in the colonial office who wanted to encourage the princely states, all of them, to become independent. So I think Jinnah also had some connection with this lobby within the British power setup.
Right. And just to, I mean, for our listeners, I mean, the extraordinary thing about the princely states is that these were not minor principalities in British India. I think almost one third of the land of the British Indian Empire was the princely states. And some of them, like Hyderabad, almost cut India in half from north to south. So the question of the princely states wasn't just to do with minor territories, they affected the viability of the future states of India and Pakistan.
Absolutely, absolutely. And after the transfer of power, both states made the princely states join them. In India, most of them did peacefully, maybe not happily, except in the case of Hyderabad, where military, police, and then military action had to take place. You see, Jinnah had done another strange thing. He had sent a message to the Nizam of Hyderabad that under no circumstance are you to accede to India. You should go down fighting like Imam Hussain. So that probably encouraged the Hyderabad Nawab Nizam to resist peaceful uh, annexation by India. And as you know, there was this military action, and there is this report, I think, Pyara Lal report or something. It's mentioned in my book and by A.G. Norani that something like 45,000 people were killed. First, the Razakars of the Nawab attacked the Hindus, and then the Indian police and then the army uh, came in and annexed Hyderabad. In the case of Kashmir, if we that's the main point of conflict between India and Pakistan. On the 21st, 22nd of October, Pakistan sent in irregulars who were actually army people dressed up in irregular dress, and tribal people, the Wazir tribe and some others from Waziristan in the tribal area of the northwest frontier. And, you know, these people were sent there to liberate Kashmir, but the tribals particularly started to loot people in Kashmir. They even, I think, they attacked a Catholic nunnery and even raped some of the nuns there. And Pakistan got a very bad press at that time. Anyhow, even the Kashmiri Muslims turned against this invaders from Pakistan. And I have recorded in my book, Pakistan, the Garden State, and in Jinnah book, I think, that Sir George Cunningham, a hand-picked governor of the northwest frontier, who had actually retired in 46, gone back. Jinnah wanted him to return. He was reluctant. Then Jinnah approached him through Mountbatten, and then he came to northwest frontier. He's written that when I saw trucks laden with loot coming back to the northwest frontier from Kashmir, I understood that Pakistan has lost Kashmir. So that's the turning point. Then, of course, from the Indian side, on the 1st of January, I think Mountbatten, who was Governor General, advised Nehru to take this issue to the United Nations, where they alleged that Pakistan was an aggressor. Kashmir had acceded to Pakistan, and that's true. When the Pakistani irregulars and tribals went in and they were approaching Srinagar, the Maharaja who wanted to remain independent. This is very important to underline. He wanted neither to join India nor Pakistan. It's too well known. But when these people from Pakistan were, approaching Srinagar, he then appealed to the Indian government, and the Indian government said that we will help you only if you accede to India. And the accession, I think, was agreed on the 26th. And Mountbatten, the Pakistanis make a big point of it, that actually, even when the signatures were taken from the Maharaja, Mountbatten accepted the accession in the morning of the 27th. Well, maybe that's a fine point. But then the Indian army was it parachuted at Srinagar airport, and then there were regular fighting going on with Pakistan. And this continued undeclared sort of war between India and Pakistan in February 1948, finally, Pakistan openly declared war with India. And this continued till about May 1948. And from what I've read, the Pakistanis were on the back foot and the Indian forces were advancing in Kashmir. It's then that a ceasefire sort of thing was not officially agreed, but both sides dug in. And there was no movement from either side beyond that point. The final ceasefire, I think, was agreed on the 1st of January 1949. In between, you have all the UN resolutions. If you want me to say something about them, I would be willing to do that.
Yeah, because I think that's a very interesting, the nuances are very interesting about that. But before we start talking about the UN resolutions, which I do want to understand, um, I'd like you to explain for our listeners what is the importance of Kashmir to India and Pakistan. We hear the claim of the Hindu king versus Muslim population, which I think is a simplification of the entire issue. But could you explain what are the claims that India and Pakistan have to Kashmir? And why does it continue to be a source of enduring hostility between the two states? And India and like many states in the post-colonial age have had different conflicts and they've had resolution attempts. But why have mediation attempts by the United Nations and other powers failed to resolve this issue even after so much time?
Well, there are several levels of explanation. Let's begin with the ideological question. For India, claiming that it's a secular state, the division of the subcontinent of the British, of the princely states, was excluded from this. It was only the provinces on which the religious factor uh, applied. The princely states were free to decide where they wanted to go. And the Indians claimed that the Maharaja approached them and he signed the accession bill. Although I must point out that in the first accession, the accession was temporary. It was later to be decided the final status of Kashmir. And India then has its own mechanism for doing that. I think in 1952 and 54, the Kashmir Assembly finally agreed to the permanent accession of Kashmir to India. But Pakistan's objection was that those parts of Kashmir which were with Pakistan had not voted in it and therefore they don't accept it. So, just to underline the complexity of the problem. The second thing was there was, of course, insofar as Sardar Patel is concerned, he was a ultra realist and he didn't want Muslim areas in India to create problem for the Indian state, secularism or whatever notwithstanding. Jawaharlal Nehru had an emotional attachment to Kashmir. So this personal angle has to be kept in mind.
He was a Kashmiri Pandit who was based in UP, but he was originally from Kashmir, his family.
Yes, yes, originally well known. Although the Jan Sangh and later even the BJP say that actually it was a Mughal family, Muslim family, who in 1857, when the Muslims particularly were being targeted by the British, they suddenly claimed to be Kashmiri Brahmins, saying that Nehru and family were actually Muslims, which is all nonsense. But this is very common in the BJP propaganda. I've seen it all the time. It's thrown at me all the time. So it's not something non-serious. It's believed by many. But coming back, the third thing is that the hydro-political angle of Kashmir was very, very important. In the way finally this ceasefire took place or the battle was going on and maybe there was a the two armies had just dug in because they didn't have the proper arms, they didn't know how to continue fighting and so on, whatever the reasons. Three rivers which went through both India and Pakistan originated from Kashmir. And India had become the riparian. The upper riparian is the one from where the water emanates first. And so that was a great advantage to India. And now, as when the Indus Water Treaty, Indus Waters Treaty has been suspended, India wants to use that advantage in a way to harm Pakistan if things don't work out the way they want. So you can see the military defense water hydropolitical nature of the Kashmir dispute. Then, before the conflict, already there were forces in Kashmir either leaning towards India or towards Pakistan. For example, in the Kashmir Valley, which is actually the main uh, area of contention, Sheikh Abdullah and the National Conference had a very good understanding with Nehru, and both were uh, committed to some sort of land reform and socialism and so on. Whereas in the Jammu area and Punch area, it was the Muslim conference led by Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas, which wanted Kashmir to be part of Pakistan. So, already, even before the conflict, there were these two lobbies trying to make Kashmir uh, accede to the state they preferred. Thirdly, very interesting, the Prime Minister of Kashmir at that time, Pandit Kak, a Hindu Brahmin, he advised the uh, Maharaja to accede to Pakistan, saying that if he didn't, the majority were Muslims and there might be an uprising. But then came the tribals and so on, and Kashmir acceded to India.
Mhm. So, I suppose an interesting question here, which I think is maybe downplayed when you talk about Kashmir, is how do the Kashmiris feel about this on both sides of the border as today? There was a UN plebiscite that was supposed to happen as part of the UN ceasefire resolution, and although the mandated plebiscite never took place, I do always wonder whether the Kashmiris overall would have opted for India or Pakistan or for independence. So maybe as we move on, you could talk about the conditions behind the UN plebiscite and why that didn't happen. And also maybe talk about, in your estimation, to what extent do you think that Kashmiris desire independence today? And how viable would the idea of an independent Kashmiri state be?
First of all, uh, as I pointed out, Sir George Cunningham's statement, as well as of General Akbar, who led these irregulars into Kashmir. He, in his book Raiders on Kashmir or in Kashmir, that's the title, says that when he saw the tribals and all, he felt that Pakistan is going to lose Kashmir. So the violence these people had created in Kashmir had even turned Kashmiri Muslims. You see, Kashmir was 74% Muslim altogether, different parts of Kashmir, including Jammu, by the way. Jammu had about 60% Muslim population before 1947. In the violence which took place, the Maharaja forces actually ordered his men to attack Muslims in Jammu, who in large numbers were killed, and then many had to flee from Jammu, and they came to Pakistan mainly through Sialkot and so on. So that percentage has gone down to 29-31%, the way you count of Muslims now. So the demographic fallout of the Kashmir conflict has its own consequences. So if a plebiscite were held in the early years, and actually there is evidence that Jawaharlal Nehru was willing for the plebiscite till about 1951-52, and he made offers to Pakistan. The Pakistanis were determined to hold on to uh, whatever had come in their possession. And you see, let me go back to the UN resolution. The first resolution is on the 17th of January 1948, saying that India and Pakistan should do everything to decrease hostilities in Kashmir. Then the really important UN resolution is from the 21st of April 1948, where it lays down that a plebiscite should be held in Jammu and Kashmir, where people will vote on whether they want to join India or Pakistan. There was no third option at that time. This has to be underscored to begin with. Okay? So they could vote either to join India or Pakistan, though the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Second, uh, since India had taken this issue to the United Nations and had alleged that Pakistan was an aggressor after the Maharaja had acceded to Kashmir, the resolution demanded that both sides should start withdrawing their armies from Kashmir. It should begin with Pakistan doing it first. Then India doing the same. But since India was the legal had a legal presence in Kashmir, it had the right to retain enough people to be part of the administration, which would see to it that the plebiscite was took place in a peaceful and in a fair manner. What we know is that Pakistan has not budged an inch from there, and neither has India. Pakistan had to do it first. And so that resolution, what followed thereafter is just appeals to comply with the 21st April 1948 resolution, and neither side has done. One thing more, I think there were many schemes on the way suggesting that while Jammu could be part of India, the Kashmir Valley would go to Pakistan, and India overruled all that. They said, we are not interested in such schemes from the UN. The UN had set up a body to oversee the observation of the ceasefire in Kashmir. Thirdly, another important thing to consider is that this Kashmir dispute has been placed in under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. There, Chapter 6 says that the Security Council is only to ensure that the disputing parties peacefully resolve their dispute. It has no other function. It can only facilitate. Had this problem been placed under Chapter 7, then the UN Security Council was obliged to take action, even military action, to ensure that the plebiscite was held or some other resolution of the conflict. So ultimately, it's India and Pakistan who alone can decide the future of Kashmir. And in 1972, after the breakup of Pakistan and Bangladesh emerging as an independent state, at the Shimla Agreement in 1972, it was explicitly agreed that India and Pakistan would resolve all their conflicts, including Kashmir, through bilateral discussions. Now, of course, after this recent military confrontation, while the Indians have suspended the Indus Waters Treaty, Pakistan has suspended the Shimla Agreement, saying that there is no need for a bilateral resolution anymore, and they invoke the UN resolution. But the UN resolutions require Pakistan first to withdraw from Kashmir territory. That has never happened. Now, what do the people of Kashmir really want? I have been making videos, writing about it in my books, that the only peaceful resolution of the Kashmir dispute is that the line of control be agreed as the international border between India and Pakistan. And every time then the Kashmiris say, please don't interfere in this. This is for us to decide. I would say that there is a fair chance, if there is a third option, the Kashmiris may want to be an independent state. But there will be strong objection from Jammu, where the Hindus are in a majority. There they would be reduced to a minority once again. And I don't think they would agree to that. So the third option appeals, I think, to the Muslims primarily. And if they can get their own state, they would like to do that. But if the choice is between India and Pakistan, it is, I think, although Indians believe that the Muslims of the Kashmir Valley would prefer India, we don't know until the plebiscite is held. And Kashmir may go to Pakistan. So there is a great uncertainty about this being decided through a plebiscite anymore.
That's fascinating. And you did bring up the post 1972 consensus after the conclusion of the Bangladesh Liberation War and the Shimla Agreement. where India and Pakistan had agreed to resolve the Kashmir dispute bilaterally
Yes.
without unilateral alteration of the existing ceasefire line, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right. Correct.
But the dynamic of the conflict, I think, shifted after that because earlier Pakistan had commenced, invasions with the army, perhaps with the tribal forces leading the vanguard, so to speak. But then in the 80s and the 90s, we saw this shift to irregular warfare instead of conventional military attacks, and the rise of the militancy and the insurgency in Kashmir, in the Kashmir Valley, especially in the 1990s. So, could you talk about? I mean, you've written about the Garrison State and the military ISI complex in Pakistan and how the groups that they helped support in the Afghan war against the Soviets were redirected to some extent to Kashmir. Could you talk about the circumstances that surrounded that shift in tactics to regular warfare and how that altered the Kashmir conflict up to the expulsion of the Kashmir Pandits in the 1990s, I believe?
Yes, I think it's a very, very sad story to what happened in Kashmir and also in mainland India. There were several terrorist attacks, gruesome, brutal terrorist attacks in parts of India. Many of them I've mentioned in my book. And you see, after the so called Afghan Jihad, where actually under Islamic law, only an Islamic state can declare jihad. This time the jihad came from Washington, D.C., and was masterminded by the CIA with the Saudis partners in it. So, what sort of jihad is that in any case? Anyhow, General Ziaul Haq negotiated with the Americans that the actual fighting in Afghanistan will be done entirely by Pakistan and will be controlled by the ISI. No foreign troops, Western troops were to come there. On the other hand, they brought in a lot of mujahideen because of American Saudi prompting to Muslims all over the world to go and fight jihad and liberate Afghanistan from godless Soviets. You see, so once that conflict came to an end, there were all these trained groups, and some of them, the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Muhammad and the Harkatul Mujahideen, were then directed towards the liberation of Kashmir from what they called Indian occupation. And already in the Kashmir, in the Indian Kashmir, there was growing resentment against the central government, where I think elections had been rigged, and Indira Gandhi was not very popular. So, with all these things converging at one point, for a long time in the Indian Kashmir, people went from Pakistan, trained, and they carried out terrorist activities, killing Muslims, Hindus, anyone who was opposed to Kashmir becoming a part of Pakistan. There was no third option, but even for these people. There was this JKLF, which wanted an independent Kashmir, but the people sent from Pakistan began to dominate the Indian Kashmir politics. And so they were trying to liberate Kashmir from the Indian occupation and make it a part of Pakistan. And I think in 1990, the few Kashmiri Hindus, the Kashmiri Pandits as they are called, I think about 2 or 4%, 400,000, some say 500,000, uh, they began to be attacked by these mujahideen, these militants. There is, of course, a story that the governor at that time, I think his name was Jagmohan, uh, he sort of prompted the Pandits to leave Kashmir. But then there is the counter story that already the militants had started attacking Kashmiri Pandits, and the mosques were giving calls for their elimination. Whatever the truth, these people then had to flee from their ancestral homeland. Actually, they are the original people of Kashmir, but they all had to leave. And the few who were left, even now, they are identified here and there and shot dead. So that's another tragic part of the militancy in Kashmir.
So I think the interesting part about the story is, or rather, a further complication in the story comes in the late 1990s when both India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons, and we finally got a nuclear South Asia. And I think the recent conflict over Pahalgam has highlighted the dangers of a nuclear war in South Asia, with Kashmir being, at the heart of the animosity between the two countries. I really don't see India and Pakistan coming to a cordial arrangement. I think it was Jinnah who said that Pakistan will be like what Canada is to the United States, to India. But I don't think it's ever going to happen if the Kashmir conflict is still smoldering. So, as the last question, how do you
If I may say something about Jinnah,
please?
this speech was meant only to attract the US towards Pakistan. You see, the Americans were opposed to the creation of Pakistan. They wanted a united India, a secular, democratic India, as a counterweight to rising China. For the Americans, their experience of Asia was first the Japanese, but more so in China, where they were supporting Kuomintang and the communists were winning. So they wanted India to remain united. That would mean the British Indian Army remaining united and then India being strengthened against communist China. But the British, they hated the Russians more and were not very much concerned about rising China. It is the British establishment, and I've given all the evidence and proof about it, which at the twilight moment of the partition saga or process decided to partition India and create Pakistan. So some things happened in a great hurry.
That's so fascinating because even today, the American policy is basically to arm India as a bulwark against China, which we can see almost to the 1940s. And
Exactly. It took them all the years till 1990 to go back to the original. Yes, I've said that in my Garrison State book. Yeah.
but fascinating. And also, I think you pointed out in your Jinnah book that Jinnah gave different speeches depending on the stakeholder he was talking to.
Exactly.
So this could just be a thing to Americans.
He was a master at this technique.
Indeed, indeed. But coming to the final question, and I know I've seen many of your videos where you've talked about this peace between India and Pakistan, but how do you see the Kashmir question being resolved in the future? I've always wondered if there's a version of maybe the Good Friday Agreement we saw between the UK and Ireland, if there's a version of that India and Pakistan might be able to sign that might resolve this long-standing issue. Or do you think that the political developments within the two countries, which is to say, the rise of Hindu nationalism in India and the interference of the military in Pakistan, do you think those factors make a peaceful resolution less likely today?
Very, very true. At the moment, less likely. But what's the option? One is to keep on arming, conventionally and maybe also the nuclear devices, but then start a war and after a few days agree to a ceasefire. Whosoever wanted it first is not important. That's how all the military confrontations between India and Pakistan have taken place. And I would say, thank God, because suppose they really have a com- total conventional war and then followed by the nuclear weapons being used. It's the end of civilization in the subcontinent. In 2002, President Bill Clinton wrote somewhere, and I've quoted him in the Garrison State book, that he was worried that neither India nor Pakistan understand the the deadly nature, the destructive nature of the nuclear weapon, and they talk all the time about using them. And he said that if they were to use all their devices, this is in 2002, of India's 1 billion population at that time, 500 million will be wiped out. And Pakistan's 170 million population at that time, of it, 120 million would be extinguished. Now, what sort of final achievement is that to resort to war? And I would say there is no chance India can get the Pakistani Kashmir. Equally, Pakistan can't get what is with India today. So, if not now, maybe in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, if we don't have this all out war, the final resolution would be India keeps its Kashmir and Pakistan keeps its Kashmir. The the military option I don't understand. And in there is a book by Pakistan's ex-foreign minister. He's a friend of mine, Khurshid Mahmood Kasuri. In his book, Neither a Hawk nor a Dove, he says that both sides had agreed to this, that for the next 15 years or maybe 20 years, I don't remember, the line of control will be accepted as the international border, and both sides will encourage free movement of people in Kashmir, uh, trade, and if that experience is a positive one, then finally the decision will be taken on the future of Kashmir. But I think once for 15 years, if it is accepted as international border, that's a way of ensuring that in future nothing else but that would prevail. But then somehow that didn't work out. Pervez Musharraf, who had actually subverted the 1999 Lahore Accord between Prime Minister Vajpayee and Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, then became a dove and went to Agra, and all these things were in place. And then after Vajpayee Saab with Manmohan Singh, there was a dialogue going on. And then just before another, document could be signed, Pervez Musharraf was removed from power. And some say that this was done deliberately because someone wanted to subvert this. And from the Indian side, at Agra, according to Pervez Musharraf, everything had been agreed. But somebody then from the Indian side told Prime Minister Vajpayee that they can't agree to anything else on Kashmir because there is a resolution of the Indian Parliament that Kashmir is uh, a two tongue. A two tongue would be indivisible part of India. And so Vajpayee Sahib couldn't sign it. I don't know what is the truth. Some truth is there in all these rumors which go around. But what I'm saying is that there was a possibility which was lost a number of times.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Ishtiaq, thank you so much for giving your time for this interview. I think it was a fascinating insight into the origins and the continuation of this conflict. And to our listeners on The Diplomat, I would strongly encourage you to go to Professor Ishtiaq's channel, maybe, and buy his books. I think most of your videos are in Urdu, but you have a couple of English videos as well, right?
No, I've shifted to English now because if India denies me an audience in India, I can appeal to I can address people in their diaspora or even people outside the subcontinent with and share my views with them. So now I'm doing all my videos in English.
I see, I see. So please do check out Professor Ishtiaq's channel. And Professor, thanks once again for joining Beyond the Indus.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
So that was Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed, who delved into some of the historical roots of the Kashmir dispute and how it's influenced India-Pakistan relations to this day. But in order to dive deeper into the present-day Kashmir insurgency, its origins, the evolution, and future trajectory, as well as understand the facts and evidence surrounding the recent Pahalgam attack, we're happy to be joined by Siddharth Roy. Siddharth is an investigative journalist and author with a number of deep dives into South Asian militancy and extremism, particularly in places like Kashmir, which have been published in outlets such as Dropsite News, The Diplomat, amongst many, many others. So, Sid, welcome to Beyond the Indus. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Happy to be here.
So, Sid, maybe we could start by discussing the origins of the modern day Kashmir insurgency. What were the sort of events that led to the outbreak of militancy and violence in Kashmir? What were the grievances that led to that initial phase of unrest? And I think I'm thinking of post 1989. And how did the Indian state respond? To what extent is this a homegrown issue versus one that has been catalyzed by foreign players, namely Pakistan?
Before I go into what you call the origin story and other parts, I'll push back on two terms used in the framing of your question: grievances and homegrown. See, they are these words are quite a cliche in how the Kashmir issue is analyzed and narrated, mainly by those inimical to the Indian state's interests. Ones who paint the Kashmir issue in a sort of black and white starkness, saying that the Indian state is the only armed occupier in the region and everyone else is a victim. Now, necessary disclaimer, anyone aware of my journalism will know fully well that I'm anything but loved by the Indian state machinery or someone who is pro-establishment. So this pushing back doesn't come from holding any brief on behalf of the Indian state, and instead comes from two clear rational points of reasoning. The first one is, by calling jihad in Kashmir something the Kashmiris have been fighting for generations and have spilled their blood and given their lives for a mere grievance, we take away their agency. The Kashmiri Islamist groups, whether you call them insurgents or you call them militants or terrorists, who the ones we're going to discuss today, they are anything but powerless and agencyless. They have been driven by a very well-formed ideology, owned and evolved over a quarter century. And as we all know, they have ample agency in terms of political power, money, muscle, munitions, and organizational strength. Second is, when you say grievance and homegrown together, then you have already accepted the construct that the Kashmiris are Indian citizens and India is their home, haven't you? Then where's the locus standi for the call of independence and Kashmiri nationalism? The reason I say this, and I want to remove these two words, is because, the nation state we call India is by its very definition a union of many different nations. Nations meaning groups formed of nativity or birth. And therefore, a group which shares, a nation meaning a group which shares, say, eating habits, language, socio-cultural, socio-political, and even socio-economic identities. Sometimes, and much lesser than the others, these groups might share a religious identity. And because of this very nature of the Indian state, it is in a perpetual state of disagreements and grievances. I mean, except for the Hindi-speaking states of India and Gujarat, all through independent India's history till date, there's hardly been a time when the states or ethnicities that make the Union of India do not have a grievance against New Delhi's top-down approach of ruling, irrespective of which party is in power. Now, these states and ethnicities do their pushes and pulls over grievance of money, power, elections, linguistic and cultural identity, etc. But they live in a dynamic equilibrium with New Delhi. So the reason for this, elaborate pushback is to understand that, how Kashmiri insurgency has its own bracket when it comes to disagreements with India. It's important to note that which are the other areas in India where you see this militancy with guns in hand, this opposition. The only other place we have that as a secessionist force is in the Northeast. So let's keep it at the background of our conversation at all times, that what's common between Kashmir and the northeastern states like Manipur and Nagaland? The answer is obvious. The first one is obvious, that it's the international border. As a result, we have borders through which militants, money, and munition can flow easily. And of course, that also leads to an unanswered question about whether this narrow idea of the Western nation state is even applicable to regions of this sort or no. Can we simply circumscribe the Kashmiri identity or the Manipuri identity or the Naga identity into this very narrow definition of what makes a nation? Obviously, these two things provide a very fertile ground for fomenting secessionist insurgency. And what's the second common factor in all of these places? It is the state of Pakistan and ISI, which have always had a direct or indirect influence, and they essentially are India's principal geopolitical enemies. Now, having set the stage for this, let me answer your question more directly about the origins of this. Well, to be very correct to the books, insurgency in Kashmir is as old as independent Kashmir itself. It was in October 1947 when the first bunch of so-called irregulars entered what was still then the Kingdom of Kashmir, October 1947. It was called Operation Gulmarg. It was the same practice that you had a bunch of um, semi-trained militants, guerrilla fighters, commanded by the Pakistani army that entered and tried to take Kashmir forcibly. So to answer your question, of course, insurgency or secessionism has been as old as Kashmir itself. There's no doubt about it. Now, if you want to ask me about how it changed, it's not 1989 onwards. It was 1977 when we had the first major shift in how the insurgent groups work, which was with the birth of the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, founded by Amanullah Khan and Maqbool Bhatt. Now, initially, if you see what they had said about themselves, what the JKLF said about themselves, they said that, our objective is to create an independent Kashmir, free from both Indian and Pakistani control. And they even call themselves secular. They had really left of center, almost Maoist-like tendencies. They revered Che Guevara and all these communist insurgents. And this continued until the Pakistani state realized that, oh no, this is not very convenient for us, this approach towards. And of course, Yasin Malik personally distanced himself and his organization in a big way from the Pakistani state. And that's when comes 1989 and the birth of Hizbul Mujahideen, led by Muhammad Ahsan Dar. And it was at that time that Pakistan and the ISI directly owned up, or conversely speaking, the Hizbul Mujahideen directly spoke about their ties with Pakistan.
Right. And I suppose because we were discussing with Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed about the shift in tactics, shall we say, from the Pakistan side post the Shimla Agreement. And I think we'll come to the abrogation of the Shimla Agreement later in this interview. But one thing he happened to mention was that the militants that Pakistan used or trained up during the Afghan jihad against the Soviets, in the 80s, some of them were redirected to Kashmir. So as we move on to the second question, I want to get a sense of what the different militant or terror outfits are involved are like. What are the structures, what are their goals, and how they operate on the ground. And I suppose coming back to your question about, using the term homegrown, a more maybe direct question would be, to what extent do they rely on local support versus to what extent are they funded or backed by Pakistan?
Okay, great question about, let's unpack the term homegrown and Pakistan funded. And there has never been an armed group in Kashmir that did not have both direct and indirect backing of Pakistan. The degree of support evolved with the evolution of each group. But the paw prints of the Pak military and ISI have always been very clear. The JKLF, which is often touted to have been a purely pro-Kashmir and therefore both anti-Pakistan and anti-India group with secular and, as I said, left guerrilla credentials, had the backing of the Pakistani state in the formative years. Let's remember that the abduction of Mufti Muhammad Saeed's daughter was, where he was the home minister at that time, was done by the JKLF with the absolute active participation of the Pakistani military. So there is no doubt that there was participation at that time. It was something the Pak Rangers claimed credit for. Now, what happened is that right after Amanullah Khan and Maqbool Bhatt formed the JKLF in 1977, they got their training, etc. But they turned in their approach towards freedom for Kashmir. As I said, Yasin Malik took a stance where he said, okay, you know what, I'm going to distance myself from the Pakistani state. Interestingly, in what is now an open secret, he built bridges with the Indian state because he found them to be relatively more amenable to democratic and secular ideas. Of course, all of this went very wrong for India, Pakistan, and Yasin Malik himself. And, it ended in the messy way it did. But it's important to note that the Pak establishment moved away from JKLF because they were being too secular and democratic sounding. That's when the Hizbul Mujahideen comes into play in 1989 under Muhammad Ahsan Dar. From that point on, there has never been a Kashmiri insurgent group that isn't wedded to the cause of Sharia, that hasn't said that Kashmiri freedom necessarily means the imposition of Islamist rule over everyone. And it is subservient. The idea of a free Kashmir is subservient, if not directly part of Pakistan. These are written doctrines of these groups. These are speeches given by them. Now, even later on, after the Hizbul Mujahideen ended and we had the two big names come in, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, they too have interchangeably used the words Islamist fundamentalism and Kashmiri freedom and oneness with Pakistan. And this went on. Now, this went on until two very important people came into the picture. One is Zakir Musa and the other is Burhan Mali. Now, these two young men, they split what was the erstwhile Hizbul Mujahideen and formed the Ansar Ghazwat ul Hind in 2017. See, though Wani and Musa's run was relatively short-lived, they were killed very quickly in their militancy career. It's a very important chapter in Kashmiri insurgency. See, earlier I noted that, the Pakistani state, which conveniently describes itself as the holy keeper of Islamist faith in the Indian subcontinent, was glad to have mixed Islamism with Kashmiri freedom. But Musa and Wani went overboard with their fundamentalism and Islamist zeal. And they said Sharia is the real goal, not Kashmiri freedom alone. Their reasoning was just building yet another nation state governed by what they call semi-secular rules was not enough. Jihad, they said, was the building of an Islamic state that runs on pure Sharia. Now, they are on record calling for the public hanging of the leaders of the Hurriyat conference itself. They call them traitors to the cause of jihad because the Hurriyat conference was holding negotiations with the Indian state and they obviously listened to the Pakistani state. They even went to the extent of calling the Pakistani flag an abomination for smearing the green star crescent flag of Islam with a white strip on it. So, in short, they became a pain in the neck for everyone on both sides in record time. Now, if I may narrate something which I have only known through off the record, sources, speaking to people on the ground, I'd like to go a little bit into how the hunt for Burhan Wani and Zakir Musa went.
It would be interesting because I was hitchhiking through Kashmir around that time, and I remember me and a friend flew out from Srinagar, and in a few days, Burhan Wani had been killed and Kashmir exploded. So I'm very interested to know how that went down.
So, I had investigated the Ghazwat ul Hind for like almost all through their existence. I was in their group chats. I used to stop whatever they are discussing and all of that. And in fact, there is a report about it in the Diplomat itself. Donald Trump in his first stint as president, he killed Baghdadi and said, "Oh, we've ended Islamic State for good." And I said, "No, who haven't actually done it, because it's still alive and well in South Asia." So, when investigating the hunt for Burhan Wani and Zakir Musa, I came across some very shocking, all of it off the record. It's not possible off the record for me because they were just being told and I can't print these things. But J&K police officers from Burhan Wani's village, veteran intel and military people involved in the hunt, they very clearly indicated that there was a tacit, if not overt understanding between the Indians and the Pakistanis and the other militant groups to not provide any shelter to the Ansar Ghazwat ul Hind. In fact, I have personally met and spoken at length with a Jawan of the Indian Army who was last posted in Pune. Though he's a Marathi, if memory serves me right, he had pretended to be a Bihari tea seller in Wani's area. And his job was to note, the timings and routes and visitors of who goes there and who comes out. And he was essentially providing logistical intelligence to the Indian forces to prep for the hunt. Now, anybody who knows anything about Kashmir will know how difficult it is to station a non-Kashmiri mole in a village in Kashmir. Kashmiri village society is very close-knit and therefore they're very aware of who's who, who's coming, who's gone, who not. The simple question here is how then did this soldier chap, manage to infiltrate and set up shop at location 0 and stay put there for a while? How did the Indian soldiers hunt the Ghazwat boys down after declaring in a photo posted to social media that they'd shoot each one dead? How come they didn't run? These young men of Ghazwa didn't run and hide across the borders safely like the Pahalgam attackers did? The answer is simple. It's because they didn't have any shelter remaining in Pakistan. So why am I telling you this story? Well, the moral of the story is this, that Kashmiri militancy and Pakistan's patronage of it is not, at its core, some holy project for the greater good of Islam. Pakistan's military leaders and their puppet politicians don't care about Islam and jihad beyond the point of their own ends being fulfilled. And as with all protracted wars, Kashmiri insurgency too has lost the plot of independence or whatever lofty ideological claims it once made. It has, for lack of a better word, for the longest time now, just been a fake proxy for India and Pakistan fighting their fights. So when you ask me how much of the insurgency inside Indian Kashmir has Pakistani support, all of it does. How much of it has the support of local population? All of it does, which does not mean that the numbers, the rank and file of the groups are all made of uh, Kashmiris from the Indian side. In fact, most intelligence reports now clearly indicate that the number of local participants, Indian Kashmiri participants, is at an all-time low. Groups like, the current ones, which call themselves the Resistance Front and all these, they hardly have local fighters. In Pahalgam, what I last have in my database is that only one of the attackers has been identified as being from India. And he too went across the border, train, came back and fought and did what he did in Pahalgam. So my point of telling you all of this is that all of it has the backing of the Pakistan state. There can be no Kashmiri insurgency in Kashmir without the explicit support of the Pakistani state.
That's so fascinating because, and you mentioned Hurriyat, and I think I want to get into the local politics of Jammu and Kashmir. And I have to make a note pre 2019 because 2019, I think, as we'll get into, changed a lot. Because, as you mentioned, insurgency and forms of rebellion against the center and central position, it has been, very common throughout independent India's history. There have been many different forms of protests. As you mentioned, militant protests in the Northeast, we have the Maoist insurgency in central India. But typically, the Indian state, in my understanding, manages to, because of its, let's say, democratic framework, it manages to accommodate the interests of these former militants and incorporate them into the mainstream. Either by carving their own state or giving them certain advantages or subsidies or reservations, etc. Maybe we could talk about how this worked or didn't work in Kashmir. Could you talk about the major players in state politics of Jammu and Kashmir and their basis of support? And how do they balance the militant groups on one side and the central government demands on the other? And maybe how would you maybe evaluate the strategy of the response of the state and central institutions pre 2019 to handling the insurgents and militants? Do you think they did a decent job given the circumstances, or did they just exacerbate existing issues unsatisfactorily?
Let's start with the point about how India handled insurgencies for the longest time. When you say that India has this approach of balancing the wallet and the bullet and giving people a choice more often than not, you're very right. See, because the math is very simple. If you do give opportunities in terms of maybe not direct employment, but let's say you were to give allowances, or you were to give opportunities of scholarships and fellowships and whatever, or send money in to these affected zones, it does two things. One is that's just good governance. That's what you should be doing as a democratic country. And especially India loves to tom-tom itself as the world's largest democracy. So it's not doing anybody any favor by, the Indian state is not doing something special by doing that. That's exactly what a democratic state, that's at least a democratic state is supposed to do. But beyond that, there is a money math over here. It costs much lesser in terms of sheer budgets to neutralize the lesser hardened or the slightly moderate people with opportunities and with money than it is to go after them with guns and bullets. And this was a perfectly workable approach for the longest time. But it obviously cannot stand alone. this doling out of money or giving opportunities, it has to work with two things. One is having the gun to say that, we can stop the wallet and only give you the bullet. But the third most important factor in this, third very important factor in this is how do you work with those elements who want to be part of India's democratic electoral process despite their disagreements. That's where the Kashmiri political parties come into play. Now, for the longest time, as we all know, there have been two Kashmir-born parties. One is the National Conference, the other is the PDB of the Muftis. The National Conference is a much easier case to analyze, starting from Sheikh Abdullah, then coming to Farooq Abdullah and now Umar Abdullah. They literally changed their name from the Jammu Kashmir Muslim Conference, parting ways with the Muslim League and other Islamic parties in the subcontinent. And then they later named themselves the National Conference, indicating that they're joining the Indian national democratic process. That was the largest. They took a centrist line that no, Kashmir is a part of India, but they recognize that there are people who will not agree to this. They recognize that there are elements they will not be able to convert ever. And there will continue to be a significant part of the Kashmiri population which will say that no, we do not belong to India. The second important party was the Muftis, the People's Democratic Party, PDP. They took more of a line which said that, no, we have to be more sympathetic to those who disagree to be part of India. We need to build closer ties. Then there are, of course, the national parties. Before I come to the national parties, I'll mention one party that's often ignored in this equation. It's the Communist Party of India. The Communist Party of India, Marxist. People might find it surprising that I'm mentioning it because they only have one MLA. But what they do not take into account is that the farmers' unions that work across the state, their largest union is the Kisan Tehreek, which is affiliated to the Communist Party of India, Marxist. Mohammad Yusuf Tarigami, the sole MLA of the communist movement, he has been a critical figure all throughout the process, the recent past, not recent really, many decades of Kashmiri modern history, where he has always taken this line, which in fact went beyond the line taken by the major parties, where he said that, no, I'm not going to say that there is only the Indian state forces which are doing bad things. There have been mistakes on that side. There are also non-state actors here, meaning the militants, who are very wrong in their approach towards things. Now, these three parties were actually very critical to the way the Indian state functioned on the ground in Kashmir. Think of it very simply and very pragmatically. I am an intelligence officer who's come from New Delhi. I want to find out what's happening on the ground. I'm not a Kashmiri. I don't speak the local tongue. I don't know the terrain. I don't know the local people. I can't get inside the villages of Kashmir. Who am I going to speak to? I'm going to speak to only two people. One is the local level cops who really know their place. The second are the political activists who work the ground. As I've been very clear in my report in Dropsite News before Pahalgam happened, what I said is that pre-2019, there was this fine balance between intelligence gathering, using local political parties, which was broken down completely after the abrogation of Article 370. Being a BJP does not really help you in Kashmir if you follow the hardcore Hindutva line. You are persona non grata in most parts. There is nothing you can bring to the table in terms of actual real intelligence, actionable intelligence, or even bring about any, development, and people won't trust you mostly. So these parties were very critical. These other parties, non-BJP parties, were very crucial to the safety and security of Kashmir. What happened in 2019 after the abrogation is that you basically you disenfranchised all these Kashmiri parties. You sent a whole bunch of bureaucrats from New Delhi who behaved in their, heavy-handed manner, who did not respect local intelligence, who did not respect local, the police officers of a junior rank and all. And therefore, the whole chain of communication broke down. And I'm saying this merely as a matter of conclusion. It's not something I've merely concluded. not only did I see this on the ground, I have spoken to none other than the serving station chief of the RNAW. I have spoken to very senior intelligence bureau people, and they've all said this in private.
Let's get into that because, the revocation of Article 370 in 2019 by the Modi government was a watershed moment in the history of Kashmiri politics. I mean, it entailed many of the changes that you've talked about in many of your reports. So, could you describe the significance of Article 370 and what its revocation entailed? And how would you evaluate the situation post revocation? You mentioned how some of the ground connect with the Kashmiri populace has been lost because of centralization. On the other hand, you see reports coming in, at least before Pahalgam, that the security and the economic situation had improved to some extent. How would you evaluate those claims?
Let me start by saying something that might sound counterintuitive. Article 370 would have been abrogated at some point of time or the other, whether or not the BJP was in power or Modi was in power. What it represents is that, see, the Indian state is maturing as a state. If any proto-state, any early format of a nation state makes certain accommodations, trying to keep people together, trying to keep powers together, rather, regional powers, local powers, etc. You cannot simply wish away those people. For example, we did not integrate independent India was not able to integrate all the royal kingdoms, all the princely states that existed within its territory right in the beginning, right? It had to go through a certain process of slowly absorbing them. It had to slowly approach the integration of Sikkim, parts of Manipur and Nagaland, and so on and so forth. Kashmir would have seen the end of Article 370 no matter who came to power. It was simply untenable beyond a point. You cannot have a state, which you call a state of India, and let it have this level of autonomy simply because it challenges the whole idea of the nation state having its capital in New Delhi to start with. And there are going to be other parties which will pick that up as precedence and say, oh, why do you let the Kashmiris do what they do and why won't you let us do what we do? So beyond the point, it would have been scrapped. What went wrong, and I had make no bones about saying this, is the way in which it was done, or rather the way in which the BJP led by Narendra Modi utilized it for their political benefit. One of the biggest characteristics, as is well known of the Modi government and Mr. Modi himself, is that he loves to go and tom-tom about town about what a powerful strongman leader he is. He did the same with the abrogation of Article 370. He announced with complete aplomb, with big aplomb, that this is the final nail in the coffin of militancy. This is the end of Kashmiri militancy, and so on and so forth. What he did not foresee, and may I say he's never shown the capacity to deal with nuance of this level, is that you cannot merely do something as big as abrogation of Article 370 and not expect it to have serious repercussions. One of which was the immediate thing that I have spoken about, which is the breaking down of the intelligence network. And once the ears and eyes on the ground went deaf and blind, a different kind of consolidation started accruing, which resulted in not just Pahalgam, but also Dangri before that, Riyasi before that, Pulwama before that. We saw that the militants who were largely outside of Jammu started moving towards Jammu. And the Indian forces were caught unprepared for it. The entire Pahalgam episode, now it's been buried, but there was a lot of conversation, rightly so, about what happened to the intelligence. How come we didn't gather anything about this? The site where it was attacked, where the attack happened, I have been to that site a couple of times in my life. It's actually not a very remote location or something. It just beats complete common sense that there was no preparation for the safety of so many tourists gathered at that spot. Any summer, any normal summer in India, people can go to that ground and see what the crowd there is. how come there was no preparation? It just goes to show this whole insular top-down approach, which I mentioned, is a trademark feature of the Modi government.
Do you think it was because they were lulled into a false sense of security after 2019? Because you did see a reduction in, militancy to some extent, right?
Yes, we did see a reduction in militancy, but that's not because and that owes itself to a large extent to the application of Article 370. This might sound contradictory, but it's not actually. See, it was a very practical thing that happened after the abrogation of Article 370. Militancy anywhere, when it has gone on for a significant period of time, dissolves into criminal behavior. And you have these little gangs and cartels and things like that form. This is true of Chhattisgarh as well. It's not like everybody who is a participant in the civil war there is a gun-carrying Maoist. There are middlemen involved. There are petty criminals involved. There are thugs involved, so on and so forth. That's an ecosystem of how violence occurs in these low impact zones. Unless it's a full-out war, you don't have those elements in a full-out war. But in a war that's been going on for a long time, it's been simmering, we'll see these things forming. Now, what happened before Article 370 is that because there were obviously elements inside the political establishment who benefited from the ancillary industries of the principal war. Like there would be a thug, say, in an area who would double up as the vote collecting guy when elections came, but he would also be somebody who worked with the secessionist groups when there were no when it was insurgency time. What used to happen before Article 370 is that whenever the police picked somebody up for basis some intelligence or some investigation they had started, there would be an interference from some local politician or the other saying, no, that's my guy, you better release him. After the abrogation, what happened is that since all of these political parties lost their immediate power to influence things, this interference stopped, which meant that technically speaking, policing got better. But understand that this is only a short-term effect of of hard measures. Hard measures only work in short little bursts. The forces, the militants and whoever, they understood that their older ways of working will not continue under this. So they evolved. And that evolution was much deeper, much more dangerous. The result of which is Pahalgam, the result of which is Pulwama, the result of which is Riyasi and Dangli.
100%. And I think that the ecosystem part of it is something that I find very interesting, because I grew up in Bombay in the 90s and the early 2000s when you still had the gang warfare going on. And the interesting part about that is it's not you have your good guys and bad guys or cops and criminals. It was very much interwoven. You had many people who just are living ordinary lives, restaurant owners, etc. Just who were sort of sucked into this. And, I can imagine a disruption like the revocation of 370, which completely transformed that ecosystem, would have caused the militancy or the terrorism to adapt. So I found this interesting, and I want to come to the recent Pahalgam attack because, internationally, there's a lot of debate about the identity of the attackers, the culpability of the Pakistan state. And a lot of critics are pointing to the lack of hard evidence, let's say, that these were instigated by Pakistan. Now, a lot of discourse on this tends to be very black and white because either coming from, the Indian state or its, supporters or people inimical to the interests of the Indian state. But given the nuance of our conversation, I have a two-part question, which I'd like you to, maybe talk about. The first part of that is, what evidence have you seen or you think ought to be presented, either on the record or off the record, that links the group that initially claimed responsibility, the TRF, to ISI or any groups that are linked to the Pakistani state? Do you see the Pakistani state having directly instigated this attack, or is there another explanation? And the second part of that is, to what extent is the Indian state responsible for the failure of intelligence and security that allowed such an attack to happen? So you can tackle these in either order you'd like.
Yeah, I think I'll first talk to the Indian side, the ineptitude over there. Among other things, one, as I mentioned, there's a characteristic of the Modi government where it's always projecting that we know best, we know better than anybody has ever known, and everything we do is a masterstroke. What that has led to is that there is no accountability in the system anymore. Despite all these attacks, we haven't seen one resignation. We haven't seen one person being held responsible. We haven't seen ministers being shunted out or anything of the sort. Contrast this with the September 11th attack. 26/11, November 26th attacks in Mumbai city. The Home Minister was made to resign. The state machinery came down very hard and heavy on the Coast Guard, on the intelligence agencies. We saw nothing of that sort happen after Pahalgam. It's all water off a duck's back. So the Indian system is as things stand today in a state where no matter what the level of failure or incompetence that is very visible, we see no action against anybody. I mean, it's just, for lack of a better word, quite a pathetic situation when it comes to professional accountability. The top-down approach only makes it worse. I have often heard officers say, and I too agree with the statement, that war is very unwanted. It is absolutely an unwanted thing. I personally never want to see wars, of course. But if war becomes inevitable, it's best conducted by professionals who understand war. Thanks to this whole personality cult and this whole propaganda over everything, above everything, before everything, we have a whole system in India now where it's all just propaganda, propaganda, and propaganda. We don't know who's doing what. Pakistan is no better. But since you asked me the question, I wanted to make my criticism of the Indian system very clear. Now, when you ask me about evidence, you see, this is a line which I've heard from my some fellow journalists in Pakistan as well. Saying, "So where's the evidence? If India really has the capabilities to produce evidence in this matter, let them produce the evidence." I have not seen any evidence on record, at least not evidence hard enough, which can prove that this was directly sponsored by the Pakistanis. I have not seen any, which does not automatically mean that this has not been done by the Pakistanis or at their behest, because of simple reactions given by the Pakistani politicians and military actors right before the attack and right after the attack. Right after the attack, the leaders of the Punjab province, they gathered in a press conference and they have said in as many words that this is a revenge attack for the train hijacking by the followers militants. Do we still need evidence, or can we take the Pakistani politicians' statement as proof? We had, before the attack, we still have a video of General Asim Munir, the Pakistan Chief of Defense, saying that they have to establish Islam and destroy Hinduism and all of that right before that. Do we still need more evidence as to why Pahalgam attackers specifically asked people their religion, if they were non-Muslim, then shot them dead? Third part of this is, I want to remind your listeners that after the 26/11 attacks, there was an effort to do a joint investigation between the Pakistani and Indian agencies, saying, let us establish things in black and white. We all know how that went. The Pakistanis simply abandoned the investigation the moment the evidence started adding up. America, which is now teaching us lessons in the rule of law, did not release David Headley for the longest time. They had blocked all attempts at extraditing the mastermind of the bombings in Pune and people connected to the 26/11 attacks. We have heard tapes in public domain where we hear the Pakistani military commanders directing the attack in Mumbai. Where is the lack of evidence, and what did Pakistan do with that evidence? Nothing. So I push back on the idea that presenting evidence itself will somehow miraculously change the course of militancy in Kashmir. It's not in the interest of, as we discussed in all this in the length of our conversation, that the Pakistani establishment needs Kashmiri militancy to continue. And when we see a dip in it, then other militancies rise. Khalistani rises, Bangladesh happens, Northeast gets a boost, and so on and so forth.
Right. So that's quite a bleak outlook, I'd say, for Kashmir. But I think it goes really into the founding ideologies, or at least the raison d'etre of these two states, how Kashmir reflects that, and how you need to sort of solve all this broader distrust between the two states to ever even have a hope of resolving the Kashmir issue. But yes, thanks so much for going so deep into the Kashmir issue and explaining to our listeners, how complicated this really is. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you for having me.